Okay, let's begin. So this is the map we're looking at around the time of the Mongol invasions. These invasions or conquests took place in the 13th century. It began with Genghis Khan, but then continued with his sons and descendants for about a half century at least. So perhaps it culminated in the conquest of China, a very, very important event in world history, which will lead to the emergence of a new dynasty, the Yuan dynasty. Generally speaking, the Mongol Empire was divided into several kingdoms or several khanates. To the east, you had the Great Khanate. The center actually was in the east. To the west were these other khanates. I'm going to be speaking about these three khanates in the west. So if you look at the map here, I'll be speaking about the Golden Horde in Eurasia, in the steppes of Eurasia, and then the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate, which is Southwest Asia, and how these related to other societies at the time. I am also going to be speaking about the Mamluks as well. Take a look at the map, southwest of our map, lower west. Egypt and Syria was under Mamluk control in this period, and this is a very important part of the whole Mongol history. They are not part of the Mongol invasions, but they are perhaps a result, a consequence of the Mongol invasions themselves. I'll speak about that. Okay, let me begin. The Mongol conquests, number one, were very, very widespread, expansive. If you were to compare this to, for example, the Arab conquests, early Islamic conquests, or the conquest of Alexander, really, these conquests will fade in comparison to the Mongol conquest, because this was perhaps the largest, the widest land-based conquest empire ever in history. But then, if you were to still compare the Mongol conquest to these previous conquests, this did not lead to any major civilizational change. So the areas Mongols conquered, they didn't convert to Mongolian culture, language, society, so on and so forth. Unlike the Arab conquests, remember, sooner or later the Arab conquest led to Arabization, Islamization, among other things, similar in the case of Alexander's conquests, which led to the spread of the Hellenistic culture and arts and learning and the Greek language to areas that were not introduced to any Greek influence before. So that's one major way to understand the Mongol invasions. A second way to understand this was compared to the somewhat simultaneous attack on the Islamic world, which was the Crusades. The Mongol invasions were much more destructive. So many cities were destroyed in the process of the Mongol invasions. Perhaps hundreds of thousands of people died. Civilians, I mean. This is really a very dramatic difference. One of the important distinctions with the Mongol invasions, an interesting aspect of these was the fact that the conquerors, a couple generations after the conquest, they converted to Islam. They embraced Islam as religion, and then they embraced the Turkish language as their language. So a Turkicization of these Mongol communities took place, perhaps in the second half of the 13th century. Okay, so what were some of the consequences, some of the legacies of the Mongol conquest and the rule over Muslim societies? Please refer to the textbook for details. I am going to be very brief here, but I'm going to be highlighting a couple of things because I think these are very important. Number one, of course, will be the destruction, the end of a universal, if I can call it, caliphate, the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, which will not be replaced really in the same way it was before. And like I said before, a second consequence of the Mongol invasions, unintended clearly, was the actual expansion, strength, growth of Islam in areas it was not introduced to before, in primarily Eurasia, to give an example. Another impact was the strengthening of the Silk Road under Mongol rulers, because Mongols really did care about trade, overland, long distance trade. They protected merchants, they provided shelter for people who were traveling, including missionaries themselves, and they were actually very open minded towards other cultures. Despite the initial brutality of the waves of conquests, in terms of their rule, Mongols surprised so many other people by the way they were actually willing to be inclusive, tolerant of other cultures and societies. But perhaps more important than these for our purposes was the establishment of the idea that a new set of laws are now in place. In addition to what? In addition to the Shari'a. Remember, Shari'a, meaning Islamic law, was in place in Islamic societies. Shari'a organized from marriage to commerce to inheritance to worship, devotion, all aspects of life, and government as well. So the expectations of a governor, of an caliph, of any ruler, any administrator, they were based on certain ideas, principles in the Sharia, meaning Islamic law. Where does the Sharia come from? The Sharia primarily came from, remember, the Quran, which is the scripture, number one, and then the teachings, the sayings of the Prophet, which is hadith or sunnah. So these comprise the major sources of all kinds of rulings, laws, administrative, civil, commercial, so on and so forth, in Islamic societies. But now, after Mongols arrived, remember, these were not Muslim, they were sometimes Buddhists, sometimes they were shamanists, they believed in a heavenly god, Tengri, and occasionally they were Christians. So, but for the most part, the initial Mongol rulers, they were not Muslim, and some of them actually didn't like Islam. Some of them were hostile towards Islam. So they imposed a new kind of laws, which primarily dealt with the laws of government, the laws of kingdom, the laws of administration. Gradually, Muslim societies accepted this. Muslim societies, especially Muslim law scholars, created an exception. They said this is urgent, there is exigency, we need to deal with this. So perhaps this is necessary. It is necessary to adopt some of these laws as long as they don't contradict Islamic law. So do they not contradict Islamic law at all? Well, to be honest, occasionally Mongol law, which is called the yasa, which was actually based on a Turkic custom, which was töre, occasionally they contradicted Islamic law. So this is something I'm not going to be able to deal with this here, but just wanted to put this here as a footnote. Perhaps we can discuss this later. One unintended and perhaps long shot consequence of the Mongol invasions was the emergence of these massive empires in this new age, in the post-caliphal age. These empires, we call them gunpowder empires. I'm going to speak about them next week. The most important of them is the Ottoman Empire. We'll deal with the Ottoman Empire in some detail, which is one of the largest, longest lived empires in world history. So this is very prominent. And there is really a strong connection between the Mongol invasions, the aftermaths of the Mongol invasions, and the emergence of these massive regional empires like the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so I am not going to speak about these in detail, but just to give you some idea, you have the Golden Horde as one of the successor, one of the Chinggisid kingdoms, khanates in Eurasia. By Eurasia, what we mean is modern Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, parts of Poland, and Kazakhstan. So this is north of the Black Sea, north of and around the Caspian Sea. So these were called the Tatars. They were also called the Kipchak. Kipchak were these Turkic people who lived in these areas, who inhabited these territories before them. And the Golden Horde elite, who were Mongol, descended from Genghis Khan himself, they actually intermingled with this existing Kipchak military element and then gradually became Turkic, gradually Turkicized, like I said before. Converted to Islam, Turks were Muslim by this time, and they adopted Turkish as their language. In other ways, their cultures were already similar. The Turks and Mongols, their ways of life were actually very similar. So perhaps it was very easy for them to assimilate into the existing Turkish culture. So the Golden Horde helped revive Silk Road in a great deal, connected Europe with China, along with other Mongol kingdoms, Mongol khanates. They were also controlling a very important couple of trade routes going from north to south, bringing fur, timber, slaves from the north, and then sending tools, instruments, silk, textile, porcelain, and spices that came from the Indian Ocean to the north. So they benefited from this long distance trade a lot. They were also prominent for their slave raids, mind you. Occasional slave raids into Eastern Europe, the Golden Horde, or Tatars. So they were, perhaps important to keep in mind, hostile. They were not friendly with other Mongol rulers. There was competition, especially with the Ilkhanate to the south. At some point, towards the end of the 13th century, we see their rulers converting to Islam and leading to wholesale conversion of the Mongol elite in a very short time. They built a new capital north of the Caspian Sea, very close to the Caspian Sea. They call it Yeni Saray, meaning new capital. But eventually, towards the middle of the 14th century, they are going to decline as a result of internal strife. They are not going to be able to recover from this. Finally, they will be destroyed by another Central Asian conqueror named Timur. Here is a coinage from one of these Golden Horde Khans. His name was Berke, and if anybody can read Arabic here, they may try to take a look at these writings here. As you can see, this is a typical Islamic coinage. You technically do not have faces of emperors, any depiction, representation of human beings on the coinage. Why don't we have this? Please try to remember what we said about the Umayyad coins in the beginning of the class and other things we said about Islam as a religion. Go back to these issues. I think this is important. Perhaps we should talk more about this. But then this coinage says on the reverse side, Padishah Islam Nasiru Dunya Waddin, meaning the Emperor of Islam. Emperor of Islam, right? The King of Kings of Islam. A very important, significant claim to make for a newly Islamized Mongol, Turkicized Mongol Khanate. This is from 1260s. This is a depiction of the Mongol troops, perhaps preparing to stage an attack on a fortress in Russia, in a city called Vladimir near Moscow. So they were ferocious and they were very well known, actually feared for their attacks, trepidation, plunder, slavery raids on the populations of Eastern Europe. Another coinage showing the relationship between these Russian, in this case Muscovite rulers, and the Golden Horde Khans, who were the suzerains, who were the protectors and overlords of the Russians at this point, and will be for a long time. So this coinage, as you can see, on the one side you have Russian inscription, on the Slavic, on the other side you have Islamic. The Slavic side does have images, representation of human beings, as you can see here. So we spoke about the Golden Horde. What about the Ilkhanate in Persia? I said Persia, but this is not actually Persia proper. It's the historical extended Persia, including this one, modern Azerbaijan, Iraq, parts of even Anatolia, modern Turkey, and then perhaps Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, some Central Asian states as well. So founded by Hulagu, who was the destroyer of the city of Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, among other things he destroyed, but that's probably more prominent. In addition to being a very destructive, very brutal ruler, very interestingly, Hulagu himself was very much interested in sciences, arts, culture, so that's interesting. He is also a city builder. He destroys these cities, but then he is very interested in rebuilding these cities as well. And among the people he patronizes, protects, is one particular scholar named Nasiruddin Tusi, al-Tusi, a very prominent Iranian polymath, religious scholar, but also mathematician, astronomer, and also political, social commentator. He creates an observatory, one of the largest at this time, perhaps the most important observatory for a long time, perhaps until the 16th century, and then puts al-Tusi at the head of this institution. Tusi will create great work, great production, great astronomy in this observatory, and others will follow. So interesting, a brutal ruler, destructive, ends the Abbasid Caliphate, and mind you, very hostile towards Islam. He is a perhaps anti-Muslim ruler, if we can use this term. But then he protects scholars and artists, and these artists and scholars, perhaps all of them are Muslims. As with the Golden Horde, Ilkhanid rulers will also convert to Islam after a couple generations. If you look at these notes here, by the end of the century, you have the first Islamized ruler converts from Buddhism into Islam, Ghazan Khan, and all the other Ilkhanid rulers follow him in embracing Islam. And they actually turn out to be good patrons, protectors, and defenders of Islam. They build Islamic cities, Islamic institutions, protect Islamic culture, society, so on and so forth. This is what I meant by saying the Mongols actually initially were very destructive towards Islam, but at some point they turn out to be great protectors and defenders of Islam. Interesting turn of events. So these are some images depicting the site, the ruins of the observatory in the city of Maraga, built by Hulagu. And this folio you see upper right corner of the image here is actually, and perhaps you won't be able to see it very nicely because of my video there, but this is a folio from the work of Tusi on astronomy. This image shows one of the Ilkhanid Khans, who is famous for being the first Ilkhanid to convert to Islam, in the process of studying the Quran in a tent. And please look at the decoration, the adornments on the tent here. Do you see anything? I mean, these figures, you can argue they look Mongolian, they look Asian, but then look at the tent. Very interesting details on the tent. What do we call these kinds of tents? They're called yurt. And also these inscriptions, they're not Mongolian, right? And this one in particular, can you read this? This is interesting. I'm going to move on. And this is one correspondence from one of the Ilkhanid Khans. Multilingual, it's more than bilingual. It is Persian, some Turkic, some Mongolian, some Chinese as well. Very interesting empire. So they are in flux, as you can see. They are converting from one culture, from one regional, one civilizational belonging, and one religion to another. An image showing the famous mounted archers. The mounted archers, cavalry of the Turkic and Mongolian societies, were what gave them an edge over their neighbors in military terms. Their ability to wield the bow on horseback. So this shows Hulegu Khan and with his wife Dokuz Hatun, who was a convert to Christianity, right? Okay, how about the Chaghatites? Perhaps the least important, least significant of these three Chingisid Khanates. This is in Central Asia. By Central Asia, I mean modern-day Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, perhaps the Xinjiang region, which is today under Chinese control, but it's known as Eastern Turkestan, inhabited by Turkic-speaking Uyghur people. Similar with other Chingisid Khanates, we see conversion to Islam perhaps a bit later than other Khanates in this case, in the beginning of the 14th century, and from this time onward, elite begin to convert to Islam as well. So that's the interesting thing about Turkic and Mongolian societies. Their conversion took place in droves. So when leaders, khans, kings, rulers converted to Islam, their retinues, their followers, their military and political elite followed suit. That's an interesting aspect of conversion in Central Asia. For the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, that's what happened. They were not great city builders. Chaghatites, unlike the Ilkhanids in particular, they were not very much interested in urban life. So you don't have many architectural evidence, many palaces, many major structures from the Chaghatayid era. There are very few, and the few that we have, they've actually been destroyed. They're in ruins. So the structure that you see here in the city of Al-Malik, which is now in China, it's not there anymore. Okay, so from the beginnings of the Chingisid Mongol conquests in 1220s, I'm speaking about the Islamic world, under Chinggis Khan, until late 14th century, the Chingisid power, Chingisid kingdoms, khanates, lasted for more than a century, but not much more, to be precise. So, for the most part, the Chaghatites were not a ruling power after 1330s. The same for Ilkhanates. We don't have Ilkhanid Khans after 1340s. The Golden Horde lasted a bit longer, but still after 1370s you don't have a Khan in Golden Horde, right? So this means the Chingisid empires, despite the initial success in terms of conquest and their ability to incorporate other kinds of cultures and demographic elements into their society, very impressive. Even Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers were in awe of the Mongol success of inclusivity and diversity, if I can use these terms, for a 13th century empire. But despite these feats, the Mongols collapsed rather quickly. That's an important point about the Mongols. There is a couple of attempts to revive the Mongol strength, the Mongol claims and ideology. What I mean by this is rule belongs to Chinggis Khan and his descendants. Legitimacy belongs to Chinggis Khan and his descendants. It was given by God to them. So remember what's happening in Islamic history, early Islamic history. Who has the right to rule? Is it just anybody, any Arab, any Muslim man from the city of Mecca? Or is it this family, this particular family, the family of Muhammad and his descendants? A similar question emerges here in the Chingisid world, in the post-Mongol world. So there is now an idea that rule was given by God to Chinggis Khan and belongs in the same family, so his successors should be in positions of power. But then, of course, the Chingisid empires collapsed. There are some people in the post-Mongol world who want to revive this idea of a Chingisid rule. Among them, the most notable was Timur Lenk, a major, very important world conqueror, perhaps the last world conqueror from Asia. to unite Eurasia, to conquer parts of Eurasia, West Asia, and he died on his way to his expected conquest of China. But then even Timur's attempt wasn't long-lived. Perhaps in the second generation after Timur, his empire also collapsed. So, what happens after all of these things? Some repetition here, reinforcement, and then some summary. So the Abbasid Caliphate is destroyed. The unity, political unity, even if the Abbasids were symbolically powerful, they still provided a sense of unity and connection and a sense of center. Baghdad was, for the most part, the center of the Islamic world. It is no longer the center politically. It was at least culturally a big center, a major center of the Islamic world, but it is no longer an economic and political center either because of the destruction, the huge amount of destruction. The city of Baghdad will never be able to recover from the Mongol destruction, will never become one of the most important cities of the Islamic world again. So that's gone. What replaces Baghdad will be the city of Cairo and Egypt in general, and perhaps cities in Syria, modern-day Syria. Cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and so on. Under whom? Under the Mamluks. Who are the Mamluks? Mamluks are actually, remember the term, we spoke about this term, Mamluks are slave troops from Central Asia, from actually the Kipchak region, speaking Turkish, and they have arrived as slaves, but then they make their way into higher levels of military political society. They are manumitted. They are free people at this point. They are generals, governors. Around the time of the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate, they rise to defend the Islamic world, perhaps more precisely Egypt, from Mongol attacks. They are the ones who defeat the Mongol armies for the first time in the Battle of Ain Jalut, which is in modern-day Israel, Palestine. And they actually repeat their success in a couple of other battles as well. So defeating the Mongols, invincible Mongols, this is a big feat. And this gives these slave soldiers huge amount of prestige. And these slave soldiers decide that, well, with this prestige and success and this proven ability to lead and defend Islam, why not them as new sultans? So they declare themselves the sultans in Egypt, the sultans of Egypt and Syria. This is going to be the line of the Mamluk sultans, a very interesting dynasty. Remember the importance of the slave troops in Islamic history, and at this point these slave troops are actually claiming to be leaders, claiming to be sultans. And they are actually very good in this as well. They turn out to be great patrons of Islamic art, Islamic culture, Islamic learning, Islamicate arts, and turn the city of Cairo and in general Egypt to the most important part, the most important place in Islamic world for a couple of centuries. I'm going to give you a couple of first a map, not in terms of land, not a vast territory they're controlling, but a very crucial territory. Take a look at this. The wealth of Nile, a huge population in the valley, including the cities of Alexandria and Cairo, but also controlling the Red Sea ports, controlling parts of the Mediterranean trade, and they are on very good terms with Mediterranean trading communities like the Italian city-states. And economically, they are doing pretty well, especially in the first century and half of their rule. The Mamluks will last from about 1250 until 1517. So you have more than 250 years of Mamluk rule. And for a long time, like I said, it's very stable, very prosperous, and very successful. And remember, another way they gained prestige was they were controlling Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, the three holiest sites of Islam. And they called themselves the protectors, the servitors of these holy sites. This and the pilgrimage itself. So these things gave them huge amount of prestige. Today, if you visit Cairo, you will find the city as one of the greatest still products of late medieval Islamic world. Beautiful architecture, beautiful art in all parts of the city, the old Cairo, I mean, of course. I'll show you a couple of sites from this: a beautiful dome, stonework, and these typical red and white bricks. A school for children in a very busy street, and compare this minaret to the minarets that we saw from North Africa, from Spain. There's some similarity, there are differences as well, but still beautiful, amazing stonework here. The same here, a prayer niche. What do you see here? Take a look at this. This is a religious devotional space. And this is the place where actually the imam, the leader of the congregation, stands. What do you see here? And what do you not see here? Does it look similar to other religious structures you see from other religious traditions? If yes, why? If no, why? Think about this. Another beautiful structure. These are some minarets, beautiful, delicate, impressive towers over these mosques. And again, another beautiful stonework on a dome. Note that you don't have tiles. You don't have these China influenced tiles that you see in the region from Anatolia to basically China. So that sort of influence didn't penetrate really the Egyptian space. There are some, but this is for the most part exception. Another beautiful structure. This is a complex mosque and madrasa and Sufi convent. This one is actually from the Metropolitan Museum. This is probably part of a door or a wall. Another beautiful vase. An entrance to a religious structure. We call this kind of stonework that consists of stalactites mukarnas. It's a beautiful Islamic, typically Islamic architecture. This is a caravanserai, another example of the mukarnas, a citadel. Okay, one last thing to say before I go is to think about the rise of the Ottoman Empire. It takes place in the same climate, in the same time period. Around the time the Mongol khanates begin to decline in power and they begin to embrace Islam and Turkicize and assimilate. Of course, there are no longer any Mongol invasions. We see the emergence of the Ottoman, very small principality initially, then it'll become a regional empire. So the whole chaos around the time of the Mongol conquests from 1250s, 1230s until 1260s, which lasts for about a half century, will lead to a population influx, a population perhaps crisis in the borderlands, in the frontiers of the Islamic world. One of the important borderlands is Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. She is called by some modern scholars as the Wild West of the Islamic world. So a huge number of peasants, villagers, commoners, travelers, wanderers, scholars found their way to Anatolia in this place as one of the areas that was touched the least by the destruction of the Mongol conquests. One particular tribal chieftain named Osman is the Turkicization of Othman, the same name that we have seen in early Islam. And Ottoman is actually a Latinization, maybe Anglicization of the same name, Osman, is smart enough to channel this energy of these incoming people, nomadic, Turkish-speaking, Islamized people, in the direction of westward expansion. And they call this Gaza. I am going to speak about this next week. And then for some reason, they become extremely successful in this. And this will lead to the small principality growing into a regional power and eventually a massive, one of the largest empires in world history. I'm going to speak about this later. So let me stop here, and I will ask you to please take a look at both chapters. I spoke about only maybe half of one of these chapters. So please, you're responsible for all of them, and I will see you later. Thanks for watching.